What's going on, everybody? Welcome back to the CUPPS Analytics YouTube channel. My name is Alex CUPPS, and today I'm going to be giving you guys my top data-driven takeaways from Week 8 of the NFL season. Week 8 was pretty rough out there for a lot of the good fantasy teams. Obviously had some of the major teams like the Lions, the Rams on bye. Some of the best players in the league were super disappointing this week. But we also got to see some players that we haven't seen do much all year break out a little bit. So it was definitely an interesting week, mixed bag for sure. But let's just jump right into the data-driven charts that we're gonna look at today in this video. So if you're new to this series, the first chart we're gonna look at is a breakdown of the top 10 risers and fallers at each of the running back, wide receiver, and tight end positions. This chart looks at the fantasy points per game of each player up until week 8, and then compares that number to the fantasy points per game of each player after week 8. So basically, for every player, we get a delta of a certain amount of fantasy points per game in terms of the differential between the value up until week 8 and then the value after week 8. The players that have the biggest positive differentials are the biggest risers, and the players that have the biggest negative differentials are the biggest fallers. This chart isn't limited to any subset of the players. It's everybody at each position from, the RB1 to the RB100. But it does typically do a good job of isolating the best waiver wire pickups or names to keep an eye on around the league rather than the bigger name players. And that's because fantasy points per game, obviously, it doesn't change that much on a week-to-week basis for players that have a big sample size unless they have some massive game that they haven't had all year. But most of the names that you'll see are names of players that have a smaller sample size. Maybe they were inactive for a couple games this year, or they really haven't done much at all up until this week. And that's why I feel like it isolates those waiver wire names pretty well and helps us realize who we should be keeping an eye out for over the next few weeks. The second chart we're gonna look at is the top 24 running backs, wide receivers, and tight ends in terms of expected fantasy points per game and how their actual fantasy points per game stacks up against that number. And for those of you guys that are new, expected fantasy points per game is a metric that I get from PFF, which basically tells us how many points should we be expecting this player to score in fantasy based on their usage and role within their offense. So say a wide receiver was wide open, but overthrown on like a 50-yard touchdown by their quarterback. Real or actual fantasy points aren't gonna pick that up, obviously, because the player did not score the touchdown, but expected fantasy points will. And while it's not some surefire thing, expected fantasy points does do a pretty good job of indicating to us who we should expect to have positive and negative regression over the future weeks. So that's what we'll be looking at in the second chart, the top 24 at each position and how their actual fantasy points stack up against their expected fantasy point production. And then the third and final chart that we'll look at in this video is the top 10 overperformers and underperformers at each of those positions in terms of expected fantasy points as well. So similar to the second chart, it's using the same data in expected fantasy points per game, but instead of looking at the top 24 at each position, this time we're looking at the top 10 players that are overperforming their expected fantasy usage and underperforming their expected fantasy usage. And this is on a per game basis as well. So it's comparing the positional rank that we expect this player to be based on expected fantasy points and their actual position ranking based on their actual fantasy points through the first 8 weeks. So what this chart does is it pretty much isolates the biggest positive and negative regression candidates at each position for us. And I like to use this chart as a good baseline for figuring out the names that would be good buys or good sells after the past week. So with all that being said, no more messing around, let's jump right into it. Week 8, CUPPS Analytics, data-driven takeaways from the previous fantasy football week starts right now. Let's go. All right, starting off here with the top risers and fallers at the running back position, and a couple names here that I wanted to make note of. Top of the list, we see Bigsby over in Philadelphia. He raises his fantasy points per game from 1.6 before week 8 to 4.53 after week 8. And he's now up to RB67 on the year. Obviously, Bigsby, not someone that you're planning on starting on a week-by-week basis as long as Saquon's healthy, but I think this week did answer some important questions for us in terms of who Saquon's handcuff would be if he were to get hurt. Obviously, we have those other backs in the backfield as well, A.J. Dillon, Will Shipley, along with Bigsby. So there was some haziness on who that backup would be to Saquon directly if he were to go down. And I think this week showed us that would be Bigsby if we saw a Saquon Barkley injury, which we did see him leave this game banged up in like the third quarter. But with the Eagles going on bye in week 9, I don't really think there's any cause for concern in terms of Saquon missing week 10 when they come back. So I wouldn't expect to see Tank Bigsby thrust into that RB1 position in Philadelphia, but he looked good with the opportunities he had. He had 9 carries for 104 yards, had a long run of 29 yards to convert on a long third down. And I definitely think he's worth a roster spot in terms of high priority backup running back handcuffs. The ceiling's always going to be a little limited in Philadelphia in terms of fantasy, just because Jalen Hurts isn't checking the ball down to the running back that much, even when they have a great pass catching running back like Saquon. And Tank Bigsby is nowhere near Saquon's level in terms of a receiving threat. So I wouldn't expect him to ever return like an insane amount of value, even if Saquon were to go down, but he would definitely fit right into like that back end mid RB2 range if he were thrust into that RB1 role. Next, we see Samaje Perine raising his fantasy points per game up about 2 on the year. And another guy that we're not going to be throwing into our starting lineups as long as Chase Brown's healthy. But it was good to see that Samaje still has some juice on the ground in terms of being an effective rusher. He has 9 carries for 94 yards, along with a reception for 6 yards, and gets into the end zone once. So I think he's probably worth a spot on your bench in terms of being a handcuff for Chase Brown if we were to see him go down. But I think the big thing to take away from Samaje Perine, rather than him being the direct handcuff to Chase Brown, is that he's really more of just a thorn in the side of Chase Brown that's going to limit his upside throughout the year. Obviously, Chase Brown has 2 touchdowns this week, so people are going to talk shit about me disrespecting Chase Brown over the past couple weeks, saying he's not going to hit his ceiling. But I still think it's very evident that the upside case that we saw for Chase Brown before this year is absolutely not going to come to fruition. Joe Flacco, he did breathe some life into this offense, and Chase Brown is getting a little more running room now that the defenses are respecting the passing game a little more than they were with Jake Browning. But at the end of the day, Samaje Perine is just taking such a workload from Chase Brown in this backfield. In this game, Chase Brown had 12 carries to Samaje Perine's 9, and this isn't like a new thing this week. Last week, Chase Brown had 11 carries to Samaje Perine's 7. So the Bengals clearly view Samaje as an integral part of their backfield right now. Whereas last year, when Chase Brown was scoring a ton of fantasy points, he was getting essentially every single carry out of the backfield. So even with Flacco looking solid and the Bengals coming around and starting to win some games, stay in competitive game scripts, and get into the end zone more, I still think it's going to be unlikely for us to see Chase Brown continue to do what he did like this game over the coming weeks. So all that to say, I know this was originally talking about Samaje Perine, but if you do have Chase Brown, this feels like it would probably be a good time to try to sell him off this game. Next on the list, we have Devin Neal in New Orleans, and with Kendre Miller going on IR for the rest of the year after last week, Devin Neal's jumped into that RB2 spot behind Kamara, and it's just not looking like it's going to be much of a valuable role in that New Orleans backfield this year. Devin Neal is a pretty interesting prospect though. He was a 4-year, highly productive player out of Kansas, so it might be worth picking him up on waivers and seeing what he looks like at the NFL level, were he to get more opportunities if Alvin Kamara misses time. But again, I don't know how much we can really expect from this New Orleans backfield this year. Then we see Tyjae Spears jumping up from 5.8 fantasy points per game to 8.65, and that's a name I definitely do have interest in as a plug and play RB2, RB3 at this point. The Titans look terrible on offense, but one thing that goes Tyjae Spears' way is with how bad this offense is, they're nearly always in trailing game scripts. I'm pretty sure I read a stat that the Titans have had the ball for, I think, 4 drives on the entire year with the lead. So they're always chasing. And the running back that's going to benefit the most from that in that backfield is definitely Tyjae Spears over Tony Pollard. Spears is a super effective pass catcher. He's shown that he can be a promising rusher as well. But I think even without a Tony Pollard injury right now, you can plug Tyjae Spears into your lineup and have a pretty promising flex play, especially in PPR leagues. Next, we have Isaiah Davis over in New York, and he's up to 5.2 fantasy points per game on the year. This is a guy I want to roster in pretty much every league right now, with the hope that we see Breece Hall get traded before the deadline coming up in early November. He's available in pretty much every league, and if we do see Breece Hall get traded, I think Isaiah Davis jumps right into that Jets RB1 role, and he's looked super good as a rusher and a receiver out of that backfield. So if he did have that RB1 role, I think he jumps right into that RB2 range going forward. Definitely someone I'm looking looking to pick up in pretty much every league that I can. We see Sean Tucker on this list as well. He got into the end zone this past week, but I don't think I have much high hopes for Sean Tucker with Bucky Irving expected to return after the Buccaneers Week 9 bye. Ollie Gordon, on the other hand, he's definitely an interesting name and someone I would be looking to pick up if I could. I honestly think if the Dolphins had a competent offense this year, we would see Ollie Gordon have the role that we saw Raheem Mostert have a couple years ago when he got into the end zone, like 10 to 15 times. Gordon has looked super effective on the ground. He's not going to do a ton for you in the receiving department, but that's why they have Devon Achane, obviously. But it seems like the Dolphins coaching staff is starting to use him as you would hope they would in terms of putting him in on the goal line packages. And I think you could do worse than a desperation flex play with Ollie Gordon right now in the hopes of him just finding the end zone and cranking out 50 to 60 rushing yards. All right, jumping down to the running back fallers, not a ton to take away here. We could talk about Aaron Jones, who drops down from 9 fantasy points per game to 7.6 in his first game back off the IR. He obviously didn't get there in the box score for you this week, but he did show us that he has reclaimed pretty much that RB1 role for the Minnesota Vikings over Jordan Mason. So I definitely think he would be worth inquiring about. If you're in need of an RB2, I would go ahead and reach out to some teams that have Aaron Jones and see if they'd be interested in dealing him, because I do think we continue to see him hold that RB1 spot with pass catching upside over Jordan Mason. Jumping over to the wide receiver risers and fallers this week, there's honestly not a ton here that I'm seeing that is worth talking about. I guess the main name in the risers that I'm interested in would be Jalen Coker in Carolina. Coker returned from IR for the first time this year last week in week 7 and didn't do anything in the box score. I believe he had 0 catches for 0 yards, but he did have a couple targets. This week he finds the box score. He does have a couple catches. He has 3 catches for 36 yards, and he's second on the team in targets with 4. So obviously nothing super crazy with Coker, but I do believe he's going to turn into the Panthers wide receiver 2 down the stretch behind Tedero McMillan. How much is the wide receiver 2 role on the Panthers worth at this point? Honestly, not sure. Probably not a ton, given how bad they've looked, but I am still pretty confident in the fact that Coker is a solid NFL wide receiver. So he'd be a guy that I'm looking at as a potential flex play down the stretch, just hoping that we get to see this Panthers offense improve with Bryce Young back at the helm, hopefully next week. Similar stuff in terms of the fallers here, honestly not a ton to take away. We see a bunch of wide receiver 3s and 4s, and then Jerry Judy stuck in there in the middle as well. The Judy fall off this year has been pretty insane to see. This week he has 2 targets and 0 catches for 0 yards, so he's goose-egged in the box score, and I honestly don't see it getting much better. So Judy, honestly probably droppable at this point. I don't think you can hope for much more than a flex wide receiver 4 at this point from him. All right, quickly moving over to the top risers and fallers at the tight end position this week, and definitely some more interesting names here than there were a wide receiver. George Kittle, good to see him back. He does get into the end zone this week. Obviously doesn't do a ton more than that, but he's back involved on the offense, and I do expect that to keep ramping up as the Niners offense gets better with Brock Purdy returning to the lineup soon. We also see a couple of the 2025 rookie tight ends on this list, starting off with Colston Loveland in Chicago, who raises his fantasy points per game slightly. He's up to 3.7. Obviously a far cry from what we were hoping for when drafting him this offseason. And I was honestly hoping for a lot more from Loveland this week with no Cole Kmet. Post-bye, usually we see a bump with the rookies getting more utilized in their offense. And honestly, it's just been pretty brutal from Colston Loveland so far. It seems like they're trying to get him more involved, but he ends the day with 5 targets, 3 catches, and 38 yards. So a pretty midday for the tight end that was drafted in the first round this past draft. The hopes were definitely high. Ben Johnson coming into town. Ben Johnson had molded Sam Laporta and made him the tight end 1 overall as a rookie in Detroit. And in my prospect modeling stuff, Colston Loveland was the tight end 1 in this 2025 rookie class before the year started. But it's pretty clear at this point that we're seeing some of the other tight ends from the class jump him pretty quickly. If you have Loveland in Dynasty, I think you're crossing your fingers and hoping he gets more involved down the stretch. But if you have him in redraft, I'm happy cutting Loveland at this point. On a brighter note, we have another 2025 tight end rookie, Harold Fannin, go from 9.6 fantasy points per game to 10.7, and he's now up to tight end 11 in points per game on the year. I did want to jump back to my prospect profile of Harold Fannin from this past offseason. I was super excited about him as a prospect, and just to show you guys a little bit more about, why I think Harold Fannin could be a game-breaking tight end at the NFL level, and why I think what we've been seeing so far from him in the NFL is not a fluke, and I believe we'll continue to see it down the stretch. So from this past offseason's prospect profile series that I did, where I looked at 48 prospects from the 2025 class, I started with the running backs, went to wide receivers, and finished with tight ends. Harold Fannin was one of the last prospects I did, day 46. This was on September 2nd. Quite possibly the prospect I'm most excited about in the entire class. That's at every position. Fannin has such an exciting profile and one that we rarely see out of a tight end. Among all tight ends in my database, which goes back to 2014, Fannin ranks second highest in production score, which is a custom score that I created that measures raw counting stats along with advanced metrics. So he was second in that score among every single tight end since 2014. The only one above him being Kyle Pitts, who's regarded as potentially the best tight end prospect to ever come out. He was also the highest season fantasy points per game with 26.54, the highest season scrimmage yards with 1,620, highest season reception total with 117, highest PFF receiving grade at 96.3, and the highest season team receiving yards market share at 51%. So that basically says that Fannin had a season where he accounted for over 50% of every receiving yard that his team had. Fannin literally tops the charts in nearly every single production-related metric at the position over the past decade. Not to mention, he did this as an early declare prospect, which means he came out after his first 3 years of college, which is the earliest that you can come out into the NFL. Bowling Green straight up built the entire plane out of him. And there were two main question marks that I had with Fannin coming into the NFL, one being, would his physical athletic profile translate to the NFL level? Fannin comes in a bit undersized at 230 pounds, and his 7.7 relative athletic score leaves a bit to be desired. And two, will he be able to handle NFL competition? During his time at Bowling Green, the team averaged a strength of schedule of -3.47 and a simple rating system score of -3.84. These are far and away the worst numbers of any tight end drafted in the 2025 class, which basically means he had a much easier path to producing than other tight ends do. And this is always a question mark in terms of accounting for prospects when looking at prospects coming from smaller schools with less competition is, this prospect might have been really, really good in his system, but that system was also playing against dudes that are now accountants or working at the grocery store, right? They're not in the NFL. And, when you have a player that's playing at a school like Bowling Green versus a player that plays at Ohio State, it leaves a lot of question marks in terms of, how are they going to translate to that NFL level? But I do think that this second question, will he be able to handle NFL competition? We have a resounding yes at this point in his career, only, 8 weeks in. Yeah, and then the last thing I say, these concerns about Fannin's profile feel overly priced in. Difference-making tight end production is extremely hard to come by, and this is the exact type of profile that we need to be targeting. And his top comp was actually Trey McBride, which was awesome to see. So you can see here that Fannin's CUPPS score, which is basically my composite score, taking into account production, draft capital, athleticism, and size, has him at 83.64, which is 8th highest among all tight ends drafted since 2014. And you gotta remember, Harold Fannin was the 6th tight end drafted in this class alone. So we had Colston Loveland, Tyler Warren, Mason Taylor, Terrence Ferguson, Elijah Arroyo, and then Harold Fannin. So Harold Fannin I had above all those guys other than Colston Loveland and Tyler Warren. And I think we can see why through 8 weeks. Fannin has been absolutely unbelievable. Even in the dumpster fire of an offense that is the Cleveland Browns, I still expect Harold Fannin to keep producing. He looks like he becomes the #1 target for whoever the Browns throw out there at quarterback. And if you were able to draft him, in the late rounds of your redraft league, or picked him up off waivers, or got him in the later rounds of the rookie draft in Dynasty, I think you should be super happy with him. I would not be looking to sell him high right now. I think he's going to be a tight end that we can continue to rely on down the stretch this year and in years to come. All right, with that tangent aside, let's continue with the risers. Last guy I wanted to just note note here. I want to talk about him a little later in more depth with a different chart, but you can see Tucker Kraft rises from 13.3 fantasy points per game before week 8 to now 16.17, and this catapults him up into the tight end 1 overall through 8 weeks. So we'll dive a little bit more into Tucker Kraft in the next tight end chart. In terms of tight end fallers, not a ton of names to talk about here. We have a couple of those Pittsburgh tight ends, Pat Freiermuth, Jonnu Smith down here, both drop a little bit in fantasy points per game after week 8. Again, I don't really think you can trust any of the Pittsburgh tight ends. They just use them all too much, and it's not really possible to tell who's going to be the main target there. And then down here, we also have Jake Ferguson at the very bottom, who drops from 17.2 to 15.05 fantasy points per game after week 8. And just sucks. I mean, he had 0 points, completely got egged in the box score. Not really sure what happened there. Hoping for a bounce back. I mean, he is one of the guys I think that could finish tight end 1 overall. Maybe that dream seems a little far-fetched now that we see that his floor is literally 0 points on a weekly basis. But I'm continuing to roll Jake Ferguson out there and hoping for a bounce back in the coming weeks. Moving on to our second chart, we're looking at the top 24 running backs by expected fantasy points per game through the first 8 weeks. And for those of you that haven't seen this chart before, I'll give a little brief overview of what we're looking at here. So you can see up at the top, we have the key. The blue bars represent expected fantasy points per game. The green and red dots represent the actual fantasy points per game. So the number next to the dot would represent the number of points that player is actually scoring. And then the dashed line takes you back to their expected fantasy points. Players that have a number over their bar is representing the fact that they are overperforming. So that would be the green. And then the red dashed lines represent players that are underperforming their expected fantasy points. So starting off at the top here, you can see we have Christian McCaffrey, the only running back averaging over 20 expected fantasy points per game. He's at 25.6, and he's underperforming that slightly with 24.6 actual fantasy points right now. We get a down Christian McCaffrey week this time, but not worried about it. I think he's going to bounce back. Still my personal favorite for RB1 overall to finish the season. But aside from him, if I had to pick another favorite for that RB1 spot, it would absolutely be Jonathan Taylor, who is drastically overperforming his expectation with 26.8 actual fantasy points per game. He's expected for 18.8. And while this would usually indicate a player being a massive regression candidate, I think with how effective this Colts offense is looking and how good Jonathan Taylor just is as a pure NFL running back, I don't really see a reason for him to regress, barring any sort of injury to Daniel Jones or Jonathan Taylor himself. But just absolutely legendary stuff from JT this week, who has 12 carries for 153 rushing yards and 2 touchdowns. And then also in the receiving game has 2 catches for 21 yards along with another touchdown. So he finishes the day with 40.4 fantasy points in a PPR league. Massive day. Colts are looking like the team nobody expected to be a contender, but they're absolutely playing like one right now. And all I can say is if you were lucky enough to draft Jonathan Taylor in the second round of your drafts this offseason, you're probably looking pretty good right now. Outside of C-Mac and JT, I still think Bijan in the 3 spot currently does have an outside shot at that RB1 overall spot. He's at 21.9 actual fantasy points per game right now, expected for 17.5. So not really the expectation we're looking for from Bijan. I want to see him get up to around that 20 expected fantasy points per game mark. But with how inconsistent this Falcons team has been looking over the past couple weeks, regardless whether it's Kirk Cousins or Michael Penix at quarterback, the only bright spots in this entire offense seem to be Bijan and Drake London right now. Similar to what I said about Christian McCaffrey, I would expect to see Bijan bounce back. Outside of the top 3, we kind of have a cluster of running backs that I kind of all view the same in terms of upside. Javonte Williams, Josh Jacobs, Achane, Irving, who obviously is hurt. I think they all kind of share the same upside in terms of fantasy right now. So I don't have any massive preference towards any of them currently, but they're all looking like solid mid-range RB1s. We also finally got the Saquon Barkley positive regression game after he had been one of the biggest underperformers at the running back position over the past couple weeks. So he's now up to that RB12 spot in expected fantasy points per game, 16 actual fantasy points per game expected for just around 15. And we knew this was coming. I mentioned a couple weeks ago that he was one of my top buys in terms of underperforming running backs. You never know with the Philly offense whether you're gonna get the big passing day for AJ Brown and Devontae Smith, or you're gonna get the big rushing day where Saquon goes for 2 to 3 touchdowns. If you ever have the chance to buy Saquon Barkley off a down game, he's always gonna be one of my top buy candidates. Right below Saquon, we see Cam Skattebo with a devastating injury, dislocated ankle, and gonna be out for the season. Honestly, just sucks to see. He was one of my favorite parts of this season so far. He and Jackson Dart and the entire vibe of the New York Giants, and just brutal to see one of the best rookie running backs going down at this point in the year. So best wishes up to Skattebo, hoping he can make a comeback next year fully healthy. I will say in Dynasty, Cam Skattebo now becomes one of my favorite buy candidates for teams that are tanking. He's looking like a great young running back, and if you can add him to your roster, I would absolutely be doing that right now. Kimani Vidal also looking like an absolute plug and play, high-end RB2, low-end RB1 until Omarion Hampton's back in that Chargers offense. He's looking like an excellent runner and adding some out of the receiving game as well. He's at RB14 in expected fantasy points per game with 14.65. You guys are probably wondering about James Cook. He has a massive week, obviously. If I scroll down here, he's all the way down at RB17, I believe, in expected fantasy points per game at 13.9, and he's outperforming that around 20 fantasy points per game. So I think James Cook, he does have the ceiling, obviously, what we just saw this past game, but he does have a floor of 4 or 5 points when that Bills offense is getting shut down, which we've seen happen in the past couple weeks. So if you could take him and turn him into one of the top players at the position, I would absolutely be trying to do that, but not selling just to sell. I'm not obviously gonna go out and sell him for like Jalen Warren plus or something like that. It would be more so to try to move up into one of what I view as the more reliable running backs. All right, jumping down to the top 24 wide receivers by expected fantasy points per game, we can see Jamar Chase remains at the top in terms of expected fantasy points per game. He's the only wide receiver above that 20-point threshold, 21.6 actual fantasy points per game, and 20.5 expected. So he's outperforming it just slightly. He has an insane 19 targets this week, just continuing where he left off last week with that massive game. The next highest targets on the Bengals this week was Chase Brown and Andre Yoshivas with 3. So it's pretty much a one-man show in this Bengals offense with Jamar Chase, which obviously love to see as a Chase owner. Continuing to fire him up, I think he's probably my #1 bet for finishing as the wide receiver 1 overall. I think it's a 2-horse race between him and Puka Nacua at this point. I am recording this before Monday Night Football. As you can tell, Rashee Rice only has 1 game. So from his previous game, 18.8 and 23.2 actual fantasy points per game, he remains in that wide receiver 3 spot per game right now, but we'll see how that changes after this Monday night game. CeeDee hasn't had any explosion games yet this year, but he continues to get there in PPR leagues, just racking up the yards and the catches. He's up to wide receiver 5 in expected fantasy points per game at 17.95. In the 6th spot, we have Chris Olave at 17.4 expected fantasy points per game. He's definitely someone to keep an eye on as a trade candidate, potentially moving teams before the deadline, or seeing maybe we see Rashid Shaheed get moved. And I would be curious to see how either of those impact Chris Olave's outlook over the rest of the season. So we'll keep an eye on that. Last week, when we were looking at the Vikings wide receivers, we saw Jordan Addison was above Justin Jefferson in expected fantasy points per game. So it looks like that's straighten itself out pretty quickly. Justin Jefferson up here at 16.4 expected fantasy points per game, and Jordan Addison down at 14.6. So I would expect to see that trend continue and that gap to continue to widen over the coming weeks. We see the top 2 2025 rookie wide receivers down here in the mid wide receiver 2 range. We have Egbuka at 14.5 expected fantasy points per game and T-Mac at 14.4. So they are neck and neck. And I would expect to see both of these guys continue to rise down the stretch as we typically do from rookie wide receivers. I'll stand by the fact that I still think Tetairoa McMillan is a better pure wide receiver talent than Emeka Egbuka, and also one that I think offers more fantasy upside. Obviously, not everything's coming together for this Panthers offense right now. Both are solid buy candidates, but if I had to lean one way, I'm going to be buying Tetairoa McMillan for sure. Another guy I'd say is one of my favorite buys right now is Zay Flowers, and obviously it's not looking like he has some crazy role. He's down here at wide receiver 22 in expected fantasy points per game on the year, but with Lamar set to return and Zay coming off like 4 or 5 games in a row of pretty mediocre performances, I feel like he's a super legitimate and relatively easy buy target right now. Once Lamar's back, I would expect to see Zay Flowers get catapulted back up into that wide receiver 15 to 18 range. Moving over to the top 24 tight ends by expected fantasy points per game, you can see Trey McBride is at 16.9 expected fantasy points per game. He's actually at 16.2, which is good for tight end 2 on the year. So I said I would talk more about Tucker Kraft, so let's do that right now. With how good Tucker Kraft's been and the fact that he is the tight end 1 overall in fantasy points per game right now, you'd expect to see him somewhere up at the top here in expected fantasy points per game, but he's actually down at tight end 11 at 10.2 expected fantasy points, and he is overperforming that by an insane 6 points per game. So I do think Tucker Kraft's one of the bigger sell candidates right now. If I could sell him off this 2 touchdown performance, I absolutely would be trying to. I just think this Packers receiving core, including Tucker Kraft and all the wide receivers, is pretty unreliable on a week-to-week basis. I don't think there's any doubt that Tucker Kraft is actually an elite tight end, and I do think he is one of the best in the NFL at this point. And while I think he's always going to be one of those guys that's going to overperform his expectation by a certain amount just because he's so good at generating yards after the catch and avoiding tackles, I do believe there is an extent at which the efficiency starts to see diminishing returns in terms of what we're getting. Not trying to disrespect how good Kraft is. I do believe he's an awesome tight end, but I think if I could move him for Bowers, which I think there's a massive opportunity there right now with Bowers being hurt over the past couple weeks and just coming off the bye. If I could move him for Bowers plus something on top, I would absolutely be trying to do that. Maybe you could take Tucker Kraft and turn him into like a Harold Fannin or an Oronde Gadsden plus a wide receiver 2 or an RB2. I would do that as well. Basically just trying to find ways to capitalize on what we've seen from Tucker Kraft in this past week, because I do believe he's more likely to end as a mid to back end tight end 1 than the tight end 1 overall. Going all the way back to Thursday night when the Vikings played the Chargers, we saw Oronde Gadsden have his second massive game in a row. He had 5 catches for 77 yards and a touchdown, which was good for 18.7 PPR points. And I honestly think the sky's the limit for Gadsden this year. Last week, he led the team in targets, and this week he had the most routes run of any pass catcher on the entire Chargers offense. So ahead of Ladd McConkey, ahead of Keenan Allen, ahead of Quentin Johnston. So I think there is a legitimate chance that Gadsden just ends up being the number 1 target for Justin Herbert down the stretch. And if we can get that at the tight end position, that seems like one of the most valuable roles across all of fantasy football. So he continues to be one of my favorite buys, both in redraft and in dynasty. Quick note on Kyle Pitts as well. He's up to tight end 7 in expected fantasy points per game at 10.7 right now. And without Drake London this past week, even with Kirk Cousins looking absolutely abysmal, Kyle Pitts did end up getting there. He led the team in targets with 9, had 59 receiving yards as well. Pitts went 9 for 59, leading the team in catches and receiving yards. So with London being a relatively late scratch this game, I don't expect him to be missing any time. But if we were to see him miss time and Pitts take on that number 1 pass catcher role in this offense, I think he would catapult up into that, top 5 to 8 tight end rankings on a weekly basis. All right, jumping over to our final chart of the video, we're looking at the top 10 overperformers and underperformers. First, we'll look at the RB position here, and you can see, if you haven't seen this chart before, we're looking at the delta between the ranks of these players. So we're taking the expected rank of the player positionally by their expected fantasy points per game, and we're comparing it to their actual position ranking by actual fantasy points per game. So when we subtract the actual position ranking from the expected position ranking, we get that delta value. And that delta value, if it's negative, that tells us that this player is underperforming their expectation. And if it's positive, it tells us that the player is overperforming. So this chart takes the top 10 biggest positive and negative deltas. So the 2 biggest underperformers at the running back position through 8 weeks are coincidentally the two biggest buys that I would view from this list of underperformers, and that would be Alvin Kamara and Kimani Vidal. Alvin Kamara is currently the RB32, expected to be the RB20, and Vidal is expected to be the RB13. He's currently the RB21. As bad as the Saints offense looks, I do believe we'll see Kamara bounce back in one of these coming games, with the only other option in that backfield being Devin Neal, who's the unproven rookie. I believe Kamara is going to take a higher workload in this backfield, and hopefully we get to see some sparks in the offense as a whole with a new quarterback at the helm with Tyler Shuck. Kimani Vidal, on the other hand, I believe is probably one of the best buys you can make in terms of production for the price right now. I think every week that Omarion Hampton is out, you can be firing up Kimani Vidal as a back-end RB1. So if I could go out there and get Kimani Vidal right now, I definitely would. I think you can plug him in pretty much confidently every week for the next 3 or 4 weeks until we see Hampton back in the mix. In terms of running back overperformers, there's only a couple names on this list that I truly view as good sell candidates. I definitely don't want to be selling Derrick Henry right now with Lamar coming back. I don't think there will be much of a market for players like David Montgomery, Jordan Mason, or Kenneth Walker with how poorly they've been playing. So I think the two biggest sell candidates right now would be RJ Harvey and James Cook. RJ Harvey finished this week with about 25 fantasy points, but he only had 7 carries to J.K. Dobbins' 15. He also only had 1 target and 1 catch for 5 yards, but that ended up being a touchdown along with 2 rushing touchdowns. So Harvey very clearly overperformed his expectation this week, and if you can sell high to someone who thinks that this situation has changed in some sort of way, that we're seeing RJ Harvey emerge as the lead runner in this backfield, then I would absolutely be interested in doing so, because I still believe the situation remains the same. Dobbins is clearly still the 1A here, and unless we see a Dobbins injury, I'm not sure we'll see an RJ Harvey takeover of this backfield. Moving over to the top 10 overperforming and underperforming wide receivers. Looking at this list of underperforming wide receivers to start, I think most of these guys look like they'd be solid buy candidates right now. If I had to pick out my favorite, I'd say Brian Thomas Jr. coming in at wide receiver 41, expected at wide receiver 19. Obviously, he's been pretty brutal to start this year, but the usage, there's no doubt that that's been there. And I do believe Brian Thomas Jr. remains a talented wide receiver and will be able to bounce back down the stretch. Ladd McConkey at wide receiver 27, expected at wide receiver 14, is another one of my favorite targets right now. Chris Olave, who I've talked about in every single video since I started this channel, remains one of my biggest buys. Currently wide receiver 18, wide receiver 6 in expected fantasy points per game. Also maybe a little bit of a grosser buy candidate, but I would be interested in buying Rashid Shaheed right now for super cheap. I do think if we see him get traded from the Saints to one of these more high-powered offenses, he could end up being a plug-and-play back-end wide receiver too. So someone I'd be interested in either trading super cheap for or picking up off waivers if he's there. And then in terms of wide receiver overperformers, I think my biggest sells from this list would probably be DK Metcalf, who's currently the wide receiver 20, expected as the wide receiver 35, along with Jalen Waddle, who is currently wide receiver 23, expected to be wide receiver 40, and Kayshon Boutte, who is currently wide receiver 37 in fantasy points per game, but expected to be wide receiver 78. So he is the second biggest overperformer among all wide receivers. Finishing off with the top 10 overperforming and underperforming tight ends, my biggest buys from this underperformer list would absolutely be Brock Bowers, who I've talked a lot about. Coming off the bye, we're expecting him to be fully healthy coming back in week 9. If you can cook up a deal with the Brock Bowers drafter in your league to get him for the back half of your year, I would absolutely be trying to do that. My expectation is we see the Brock Bowers that we saw in week 1 and last year looking like the best tight end in the NFL. I would also love to try to acquire Tyler Warren if possible, Kyle Pitts, Harold Fannin, Jake Ferguson, some of my other favorite buy low prospects. Especially Jake Ferguson, who coming off that goose egg game, he could be someone that would become available. And I still view him as a top 3 to 4 tight end the rest of the way. So absolutely someone I'd be looking to buy low. In terms of tight end sells, the biggest one I already talked about being Tucker Kraft, but I would also be absolutely interested in selling Dalton Kincaid if I could, who is currently the tight end 8, but expected to be the tight end 22. Dallas Goedert, also not a terrible sell right now. He is currently the tight end 5, but expected to be the tight end 10. Not looking to sell Kittle, who is currently a tight end 22, expected to be tight end 36. Not really paying too much attention to those numbers with the time he missed. I'm thinking we'll get to see George Kittle get back into the swing of things over the coming weeks. All right, that'll do it for my data-driven takeaways from week 8 of the NFL season. If you enjoyed this video, I would appreciate it if you could leave a like, drop a comment, let me know what you would like to see different. Let me know if there's any other data visualizations that I did not cover that you would also like to see in the coming weeks. And if you have not yet subscribed, please do so. Help me grow this channel. It would mean the world to me. That's all I got for you guys this week. Thank you so much for watching. Remember to like, comment, and subscribe, and I will see you in the next one.